Chapter 4. You're back. Tosh looked up from her console. Things had not been going well. 2 weevils had to be explained away. Or, rather, concealed and a false trail planted to cover their tracks. How was the trip? Owen gave her a don't start look. I meant, you know, in general. She looked away at Owen's expression. How was the northern nutter? Gwen prompted, sardonically. Owen threw his medical bag down, scowling. Went, yeah? Treated her, right. Then came back. Savvy? And she was well? Jack prompted. Yeah, well, Owen said, vaguely. She was ... Mallory. Jack grinned. Good enough. Then, he slapped his thigh. Right. Now you're back, need you to run a DNA sample on those 2 weevils, to add to the database. Now? Owen sighed, exhausted. Yeah? Jack walked around the gantry, having passed a pile of notes from Tosh's desk to Gwen. And match up as closely as possible anyone we've got in deep freeze. The Hethley need a body, too, this time, in place of our little friends. You mean the police, Owen translated, of Jack's best pronunciation of the Welsh word. And I've just got back. Yes, nodded Jack. Now. Owen worked. He thought as he worked, boiling the tissue samples in ethanol before they could be centrifuged. He had used the sonic device Jack had lent him to open the Gatsby fire knocking at the door. It had taken a long time for Mallory to answer the door. Her face had been bright, as if expecting him. Though not him, as her face fell when Owen had greeted her. I thought it was Torchwood too, she had said, pushing open the door so Owen could get through. You were expecting me? Owen had said. Mallory nodded as she showed him into the living room. A goldfish swam in the liquid in which what looked like a small pair of lungs were immersed. Jack said. I thought you might be Archie. He keeps an eye on me, he promised Dad. Archie McLeish? Mallory nodded. Sometimes he brings me things, like flowers. Mallory cast a look into the garden. Though it was only April, roses were blossoming. Then, she gestured to the mantelpiece, where scores of flowers were grouped in bunches, jostling for space. Beautiful, Owen murmured. They're from near T2's base. Mallory enthused. Groundsel, forget-me-not, primroses. They were arranged in little bunches in jars along the fireplace. The headaches. Jack's voice cut into Owen's daydream. But, he wasn't prepared to stop just yet. Mallory had been wearing a maxi dress, which looked as if it had been handmade from a bedsheet and had paced around barefoot, her pale hair falling down her back. Jack was leaning over the railings of the Medi Bay, waiting for Owen to answer. Doing too much, he replied, remembering the stacks of paper, gadgets and tech all over Torchwood 4's living room. Forgets to eat. Forgets to sleep. He looked up from the skin tissue assay. Could be stressors from these. Or some form of brain illness. An illness? To be brilliant? Tosh put in. A kind of autism, Asperger's, maybe? Beyond gifted, Owen mused, extracting the DNA must from first one vial, then the other. I think the correct term you are looking for is neurodiversity, put in Yanto. Owen looked up as JCK folded his arms. There's a spectrum, and then there's Mallory ... off the scale ... beyond it. He reached for the coffee cup Yanto was offering, taking a sip, before nodding approvingly. And to think, we nearly didn't have her, she was nearly lost ... Torchwood 1 did its worst. Jack took up Owen's paperwork. If he turned now, he would see Yano's pained face. How? Jack ignored the question. People are hard work for her. Imagine a mind that sees every little detail, can interpret every little minute piece of body language. Too much for her. But she made a good teacher. They were sorry when she left. Gwen raised an eyebrow of mockery to Owen at Jack's last statement, who shrugged, and fed Weevil 1's DNA into the gas chromatograph. Then, she went back to take over from dear old Dad? Gwen prompted. I don't think she ever left, not mentally. We owe such a lot to that girl, and barely anyone knows who she is. Well, Owen replied, adding sample 2 to the GC. Archie McLeish knows her well, comes down to see her a lot. Him? Ianto scoffed, as he ordered the pizza. Must be 3 times her age, and a porn problem. But knew her father, Tosh pointed out. Knows what she's going through. And do we know anything about this mysterious Mark? Husband? Who no longer exists? Gwen asked. Jack raised an eyebrow. You paid attention, Gwen. Well done. Maybe, said Ianto, surprisingly. Mark Jones. But then he turned away, and strode to the inner exit door. Gwen, Owen and Tosh all looked at Jack in unison, who shrugged. I will to go back. Owen refused to meet Gwen's accusing stare. Need to see how the nerve injections I gave her are helping. I'll see what else I can dig up. Before Jack could reply, however, Ianto pushed back through into the hub. I found something. Ianto enthused, holding up a piece of yellowing newspaper. I knew something about Torchwood 1 and Ren. He passed it over to Owen, who put down his instruments as the printer produced the GC results. The doctor climbed the stairs, before passing it to Tosh, who read, Human Selective Breeding Program. Her brownies looked between Owen and Jack. What? Gwen asked. Selecting characteristics to build the ultimate natural human. No biotech, Owen offered, as Gwen took up the paper. Like they do WTH dogs, cats, horses, for speed and temperament. But that's eugenics, isn't it? Gwen replied. Weren't the Nazis doing that? Not just them, Jack replied, arms folded. It was common in the 20s and 30s. Not a negative connotation in sight. People wanted to think ailments, conditions, could be bred out of the human race. The Nazis just took it and applied it to their twisted ideology. What you're saying, Jack, is that Ren was part in a genetic experiment. I should ask Mallory, said Owen, glancing at the paper again, when I'm up next. No. Jack shouted, tearing the newspaper page from his hand. You shouldn't know about this. He turned to Ianto, thrusting the sheet into his hand. She is vulnerable. You go anywhere near her with questions like that and I will kill you. He took a step towards Owen, who held up his hands, defensively. But Gwen stepped towards their boss, face determined, stubborn. What is the Ren programme, Jack? Leave it. He rounded on her, spitting back the words. No. Gwen looked defiant. Not when you were compromised. You took us to Torchwood 4, Jack, you told us about her. Why? Not just for tech. All right, Jack exhaled, then wagged a finger at their doctor, but you will not mention it to her, Owen. Owen put his hands in the air defensively. All right, I won't. It was a program under Torchwood 1, way back into the early 20s. The best minds, the best talents all contributed to the idea of a perfect human. And they did, finding one person with the most ideal attributes, longevity of life, good temper, resistance to disease, and so on, and another, similarly well disposed genetically, to give one egg and one sperm. But that's like IVF? Gwen asked. Now, hold on. That wasn't around until the 70s, at the very least. Oh, she finished. It was like every time, Torchwood was always the pioneer. And baby was Ren? Tosh prompted, brightly. Weapons-ready engineering, Ianto interrupted, avoiding Jack's look of fury. The ultimate human soldier. Hang on, you said Mallory's mum was called Ren, Gwen interjected. Yes. I did, replied Jack. He gave a I'm telling this look to Ianto, who fell silent. Ren was amazing, beautiful, graceful, lively. Everything you could want in a human. Ready as the ultimate weapon. No emotion, no empathy. But she was kept there, growing up in a cage, a bare-walled laboratory, never no children her own age, never going to school, playing like normal kids. Knew only Torchwood. He sighed. The situation on the continent grew steadily worse. Both fascism and communism were on the rise. And the day came she was supposed to marry Archie McLeish, the Torchwood founder. But that's just sick. Gwen interrupted. Bred like a lab rat and set up like a medieval, like an arranged marriage. She trailed off. Many marriages, more than not, have been arranged, Gwen. But love dash. Gwen protested. Security, compatibility, diplomacy, politics. He paced back to the gantry and peered over the railings as the printer continued to produce its results from DNA analysis. All of these have been better reasons than love. But he must have been old then, Tosh pointed out. And still run Torchwood 2 today? But instead she met Roderick Collier, Jack continued, ignoring Tosh, Archie's friend and partner in Torchwood 2, who set up Torchwood 3. Nature took its course, something Torchwood 1, no matter how carefully they'd selected her building blocks, could not prevent. Roderick helped her to escape from one and they eloped. Damn well near broke Archie's heart. Are you telling us Archie McLeish, the same man who I met in Glasgow, with the filthy magazines, is the Torchwood founder? Questioned Gwen, in disbelief. Is the same man the genetically engineered Wren stood up at the altar? Tosh looked at Jack's features carefully, for the merest hint of mick-taking. Literally, said Jack, gravely. Archie, who comes down to see Mallory sometimes and gives her flowers? Owen asked. I bet he does. Gwen scoffed. She does like flowers, Jack replied. Eugh. How could she? With an old man? Gwen wrinkled her nose in disgust. They are the same, Jack replied, like we are, sharing the same threats, using the same thinking. We do lonely jobs. He looked pointedly at Gwen, who had the decency to look away. Her gaze landed on Owen's face. I wonder, does she get all hot when he arrives, and takes off all her clothes? Gwen asked slyly. Owen rolled his eyes. But selective breeding ... it doesn't always come out how you'd expect. Jack pressed on with the story. Torchwood 1 wanted revenge for Wren's escape, something which has made Mallory terrified of them and UNIT. This is how I came to know who she was, interrupted Ianto, suddenly. I was sent to an interview, Roderick. Mallory must have gone back to live with him, then. He smiled at his memories. That's when I remember her, except, Tosh prompted. THST she wasn't grown up when I met her. She must have been a teenager? It must have been before she went to university. Only. Ianto looked round at the others, as if their faces, eager to know more, would clear up his cognitive dissonance. I went there after Mark returned to 1. He must have died when 1 was taken over by Cybermen. Ianto looked across to Jack. If she is aware of what her mother was bred for. Acutely aware, Jack confirmed, obsessively aware. Lucky for Mallory Torchwood 1 was liquidated, Jack concluded, then proceeded down the steps of the Bay, turning away so he did not see the pained look on Ianto's face. 88,888,888. Are you well? Jack's visit the next day was surprising for Mallory, who greeted him, after some delay and security checks, in a 1950s dress, flares and trainers. I am better, she confirmed, with a bright smile. Then, her face crumpled. Is what I do important, Jack? She quavered. Does it make a difference? Hey, what's brought this on? Jack soothed, drawing Mallory to him like a forlorn child, rubbing her back gently. He glanced at the reception Rockham's coffee table. Magazines. That was new. With that month's date on them. I had a life, she mumbled into his chryso, grey shirt, tears soaking into it. I tried so hard to fit in. You never had to, said Jack, waiting for her tears to stop, before taking her hand. I had to try. Mallory wailed. I saw life, Jack, I did what my mother wanted of me. Did you know her? She pulled away to examine Jack's face. I was there, when you were born. Jack smiled, stroking the back of her hand, comfortingly. Your dad, he was so proud, so happy. There is nothing the doctor could have ever shown that man that could have come as close as the joy that he felt when he first held you. He smiled. She knew the story, knew Jack had been there. He couldn't die, that was his only reason for being midwife, so to speak. Yet, Mallory was in a state and needed the reassurance of a familiar story. And then Mum, mused Mallory, looking away. She had to go. Too much had been sacrificed to bring Mallory back to now. Jack let the story run. She had to die, as was the course of her timeline. But you didn't. You are so special, Mallory. So many people rely on what you do, so many people, and they don't know you. Yes, Mallory said, her voice low, resentment now in it. I know these people, I've met ... unit ... I miss him, Jack, Mallory said sorrowfully. Yet, there was a sting of scorn there too. 6 months after saying her vows, a year after us meeting. Jack looked away, his own face filling with black, sickening regret. He had played his part in Mark's betrayal of her. She probably knew it. And the worst part, the worst possible part was, even if he had admitted it to her, she would turn her serious face to him and tell him she forgave him. Because, Jack concluded, he understood her, so nothing he did made her angry with him, when she really should be. Mallory's own search for connection, like all in Torchwood, always outweighed moral judgments. I know you couldn't have done anything different, Mallory now justified to him. One life, or millions. Economics. I had a year of life with him, I may never have met him. And then, when he told me the truth, I took him back ... back to unit, Mallory clarified, spitting the word. Returned their experiment, after I had done everything I could. I begged ... I pleaded with them to stay with him. He was ill, Jack, she explained. I know, he soothed. Organ failure. And they just closed the door with me on the other side of it, like I was waste. Mallory turned away from Jack, folding her arms. He could imagine her expression and did not want to see it. Like me, because of Mum. Mallory's voice was soft, and Jack had to trust he had even heard her speak. You are nothing of the sort. But I make a difference. It wasn't a question. It was an acceptance. Jack placed his hands on her shoulders. It really was a good dress, vintage raw silk in blush pink, knee-length, full skirt. Would have done better in ballerina flats, rather than trainers, and also, those flares should be burned as an example to all 70s wear never to re-emerge from the shadows. Good, she said, brightening up, her teeth ground as to be counterbalance to the pain she was hiding, no doubt from her head, no doubt to avoid him sending Owen to treat her. I am sorry, Jack, I always forget that offering drinks is seen to be polite when people come. Would you like a cup of tea?